Thomas shivered in the cold morning air as he scraped ice from his car windshield. The temperature had dropped below freezing overnight, and his thin jacket didn't offer much protection. His breath formed small clouds that disappeared quickly, in the darkness. It was 5:30 a.m. and Thomas needed to get to his job at the city maintenance department. For 20 years he had never missed a day of work. This perfect attendance record mattered to him, even if no one else seemed to notice or care. Blue lights suddenly flashed behind him, lighting up the quiet street. Thomas felt his heart beat, faster as a police car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out and walked toward him. "License and registration," said the taller officer, whose name tag read, Officer Wilson. Thomas reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out his wallet. He handed over the documents while trying to stay calm. "Your taillight is out," Officer Wilson said after looking at Thomas's license, "and you have an unpaid parking ticket from 3 months ago." "I paid that ticket already," Thomas explained quietly. "I have the receipt at home. I can show you. Later if you'd like." The shorter officer, Officer Baker, laughed a little. "Sure you do. Step out of the vehicle, please." Thomas did as he was told. Standing on the icy pavement, he felt the cold seeping through his worn-out shoes. He tried again, to explain about the ticket and mentioned that he needed to get to work on time. "Listen," Officer Wilson said with a smirk. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. 20 push-ups right here and we'll let you go with just a warning." "What?" Thomas asked in disbelief. "Push-ups? I don't understand." "It's simple, officer," Baker added. "Do 20 push-ups or we take you to the station for the unpaid ticket. Your choice." Thomas looked around. A few neighbors had started peeking through their windows, curious about the police lights. His face burned with embarrassment despite the cold air. "The push-ups, please," Thomas finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He slowly lowered himself to the ground. The icy pavement burned against his palms as he positioned himself for the first push-up. The officers stood watching, small smiles on their faces. 1, Thomas counted as he pushed himself up and down. "Louder." "We can't hear you," Officer Wilson commanded. 1, Thomas shouted, feeling a mix of shame and anger. 2, 3, 4. By the 10th push-up, Thomas's arms were shaking from both the cold and the effort. His fingers had gone numb where they pressed against the ice. He could hear the officers laughing quietly. 11, 12. His voice grew weaker, but he kept going. What the officers didn't know was that Thomas Brown wasn't just any city maintenance worker. Yesterday, after months of interviews and hard work, Thomas had been appointed as the new city manager, effectively the boss of all city operations, including the police department. He had planned to announce it at the end of the week. 19, 20. Thomas finished the last push-up and slowly stood up. His hands were red and raw from the frozen ground. "Good job," Officer Wilson said with a laugh. "You can go now. Get that taillight fixed." The officers returned to their car, still chuckling. Thomas watched them drive away before getting into his own car. He sat for a moment, catching his breath, trying to process what had just happened. As he drove to work, his embarrassment slowly turned to determination. The officers had treated him badly because they thought he was nobody important. They had no idea who he really was or what position he now held. When Thomas arrived at City Hall, his assistant Emily greeted him with a bright smile and a bouquet of flowers. "Congratulations on the new position, Mr. Brown," she said cheerfully. "The police chief wants to meet with you first thing this morning." Thomas nodded, keeping his face calm despite the emotion swirling inside him. "Perfect timing," he replied quietly. He walked into his new office, still feeling the sting of the morning's humiliation. As he sat at his desk and looked at the day's schedule, Thomas made a decision. Those officers would learn a very important lesson soon, one they wouldn't forget. Thomas sat at his large desk, still feeling the sting in his palms from the icy pavement. His new office was spacious and bright, with windows overlooking the city he had served for 20 years. He stared at the phone, thinking about what had just happened. What the laughing officers didn't know as they drove away was that Thomas Brown had started as a janitor in this very building. He had mopped these floors while studying at night school. Year after year, he earned his degrees and worked his way up through the ranks. Now, after 2 decades of hard work, Thomas had been appointed as the new city manager, effectively in charge of all city departments, including the police. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Thomas called. Emily entered with, "A cup of tea." "You look cold, sir. Thought you might need this." "Thank you, Emily." Thomas accepted the warm cup gratefully. "Is Chief Phillips here yet?" "He's waiting in the meeting room," she replied. "Shall I send him in?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, please. And Emily, could you do me a favor? Pull the personnel files for Officers Wilson and Baker from the police department." Emily looked curious but didn't ask questions. "Right away, sir." When she left, Thomas opened his desk drawer and took out the receipt for the parking ticket the officers had mentioned. He had paid it weeks ago. He also pulled out his phone and scrolled to the photos he had taken of his car just minutes after. The officers had left. All the lights were working perfectly. Chief Phillips knocked and entered the office. He was a tall man with gray hair and a friendly face. "Mr. Brown," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Congratulations on your appointment. I look forward to working with you." Thomas looked at the offered hand but didn't take it. "Please sit down, Chief Phillips." The chief's smile faded slightly as he took a seat across from Thomas. "I had an interesting experience this morning," Thomas began, keeping his voice calm and level. "2 of your officers stopped me outside my home." Thomas recounted the morning's events in detail. The false claim about the tail light, the already paid parking ticket, and the push-ups on the freezing ground. He kept his tone even, never raising his voice. "I see," Chief Phillips said when Thomas finished. His face had grown pale. "That's completely unacceptable behavior. I'll discipline those officers immediately." "No," Thomas said firmly. "I don't want them disciplined. I want them removed from duty." Chief Phillips looked shocked. "Sir, with all due respect, immediate termination might be too harsh. Perhaps a suspension." "Let me tell you something, Chief," Thomas interrupted. "For 20 years I cleaned the toilets in this building. I emptied the trash cans. I mopped the floors. Not once in all those years did I use whatever small power I had to humiliate another human being." Thomas placed the receipt and the photos of his car on the desk. "Those officers didn't make a mistake this morning," he continued. "They revealed their character. They thought I was nobody important, so they felt they could treat me however they wanted." Chief Phillips looked at the evidence and sighed heavily. "I understand your anger, Mr. Brown, but perhaps there's another way to handle this. Those officers have families, mortgages." Thomas leaned back in his chair, thinking of his grandmother Mary. She had raised him after his parents died and taught him important lessons about power and responsibility. "When you have power over others," she would say, "you must be twice as careful how you use it." Emily knocked and entered with the personnel files. Thomas thanked her and began looking through them. Officer Wilson had been with the department for 8 years. Officer Baker for 5. Neither had serious complaints in their records. "I need to think about this," Thomas finally said. "Please have both officers report to my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. After Chief Phillips left, Thomas spent the rest of the day in meetings learning about his new responsibilities, but his mind kept returning to those moments on the cold pavement. That evening, as everyone else went home, Thomas stayed in his office. He drafted 2 termination papers, one for each officer. His finger hovered over the print button. Was this the right response? Was this the kind of leader he wanted to be? A memory surfaced of his grandmother's voice. "The measure of a person isn't how they use power, but how they choose not to use it." Thomas stared at the computer screen, wrestling with his decision. The office grew dark as the sun set, leaving him alone with the most important choice of his new position. Thomas arrived early at his office the next morning. He had slept poorly, his mind troubled by the decision he needed to make. The termination papers sat on his desk, printed but not yet signed. He ran his fingers over them, feeling the weight of his authority. At precisely 9 now, Emily knocked on his door. "Chief Phillips is here with Officers Wilson and Baker," she announced. "Send them in." Thomas replied, sitting up straighter. The three men entered the room. Chief Phillips looked tense. The two officers appeared confused until they recognized Thomas. Their faces instantly drained of color. "You know why you're here," Thomas said calmly. Officer Wilson, the taller one who had ordered the push-ups, stepped forward. His confident demeanor from yesterday was completely gone. "Sir, we had no idea who you were." Thomas studied him for a long moment. "And that makes it worse, doesn't it? You thought I was nobody important, so you felt free to treat me poorly. We were just having some fun," Officer Baker tried to explain, his voice shaking slightly. "Fun?" Thomas repeated. He opened a folder on his desk. "I have the receipt for the parking ticket you claimed I hadn't paid. I also have photos showing all my car lights working perfectly fine." He turned the folder toward them. "Would you like to explain that?" Both officers looked down at their shoes. "No explanation?" Thomas asked. "Then let me tell you something about myself. 20 years ago, I started working in this building as a janitor. I cleaned toilets and mopped floors while studying at night to better myself. I worked hard every single day. Not once did I use whatever small position I had to make someone else feel small." Thomas stood up and walked to the window. Outside, city workers were clearing snow from the sidewalks. He watched them for a moment before turning back to face the officers. "Yesterday morning you had power over me. You used that power to humiliate me. Today I have power over you." He picked up the termination papers from his desk. The officers stared at the documents, their faces growing even paler. "Please, sir," Officer Wilson whispered. "I have a family, a mortgage. This job is everything to me." Thomas thought of his childhood, growing up poor with his grandmother after his parents died. She had worked 2 jobs to support them, yet always found time to help neighbors in need. "Power without compassion is worthless," she would tell him. "Yesterday, did you think about my family or my job when you made me do push-ups on the ice?" Thomas asked. Neither officer answered. Chief Phillips cleared his throat. "Mr. Brown, I understand your anger, but perhaps a suspension—" "I'm not angry," Thomas interrupted. "I'm disappointed. These men represent our city. They carry badges and guns. They have authority over other citizens, and they abuse that authority for their amusement." Thomas looked at the termination papers again. He thought about how it would feel to sign them, to exercise his new power. It would be satisfying, certainly. But would it solve the deeper problem? "I grew up with very little," Thomas said more softly. "But my grandmother taught me that we are defined not by what happens to us, but by how we respond. Yesterday, you showed me who you are. Today, I need to show you who I am." He tore the termination papers in half. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. "Here's what's going to happen," Thomas continued. "Starting tomorrow, I'm creating a new training program for the police department. All officers will spend 1 week working alongside our city's maintenance workers, homeless shelter volunteers, and community service teams." He looked directly at Wilson and Baker. "You two will be the first participants. You'll clean streets, serve food at shelters, and help the people you've been sworn to protect. You'll experience what it's like to be seen as invisible, as not important enough for basic respect." Thomas sat back down at his desk. "After that week, you'll write me a report about what you learned. If I believe you've genuinely understood the problem with your behavior, you can keep your jobs. If not, you'll clear out your lockers. Is that clear?" Both officers nodded quickly, relief and shame mixing on their faces. "Thank you, sir," Officer Wilson said quietly. As they turned to leave, Thomas called after them. "Remember this moment. Remember how it feels to have someone show you mercy when you don't deserve it. And the next time you have power over someone who seems unimportant, remember to do the same." Thomas watched through his office window as Officers Wilson and Baker arrived at the city maintenance yard early Monday morning. They were no longer in their neat police uniforms, but instead wore bright orange vests over simple work clothes. From his view, he could see their uncomfortable expressions as they reported to James, the maintenance supervisor. 3 months had passed since Thomas became city manager. His new training program had caused quite a stir in the police department. Some officers complained about being asked to do janitor work. Others understood the purpose and supported the idea. Chief Phillips had initially been skeptical but eventually helped organize the rotations. James handed the two officers trash bags and pointed to a littered section of the park. Thomas watched as they hesitantly began picking up garbage. "Officer," Wilson held his bag at arm's length, his face twisted in disgust. Officer Baker kept looking around, clearly worried someone might recognize him. Thomas turned away from the window and focused on his work. He had a city to run. The police department was just one of many challenges he faced. Later that afternoon, Thomas visited the homeless shelter where the officers were scheduled to serve dinner. He arrived early and helped the regular volunteers set up tables and chairs. He had done this work before many times, long before becoming city manager. When the officers arrived, they didn't notice Thomas at first. He watched as Mary, the shelter director, showed them how to serve food and where to stand. The officers looked uncomfortable in their aprons, but didn't complain. Soon, people began arriving for dinner. Most were tired, some were dirty, and a few seemed angry. Thomas observed as Officer Wilson served mashed potatoes to a man who didn't thank him, or even look at him. Wilson's face showed surprise at being treated as if he were invisible. Officer Baker had a different experience. An elderly woman smiled warmly as he served her soup. "God bless you, young man," she said kindly. Baker looked startled, then managed a small smile in return. Later, as the dinner service continued, Thomas approached the serving line. When Officer Wilson looked up and saw him, he froze, the serving spoon mid-air. Thomas simply held out his tray. "Evening, Officer Wilson," Thomas said calmly. "The potatoes look good today." Wilson recovered quickly and served him. "Yes, sir, they do." Thomas moved down the line to Officer Baker, who served him soup without meeting his eyes. "How's the first day going?" Thomas asked both men. "It's different," Wilson admitted. "Not what I expected." "Different how?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. "These people," Wilson hesitated. "Some of them don't even see me. It's like I'm not even here." Thomas nodded. "That's how many people feel, every day. The janitor cleaning your office, the person collecting your trash, the homeless man you drive past, invisible." Before either officer could respond, Mary called them back to work. Thomas took his meal to a table and ate with the shelter residents, listening to their stories as he had done many times before. The week continued with both officers rotating through different city services. They cleaned public restrooms in the park, filled potholes on back streets, and served more meals at the shelter. Thomas kept tabs on their progress through reports from the supervisors. By Thursday, something had begun to change. James reported that Officer Wilson had arrived early to help an elderly maintenance worker lift heavy bags of mulch. At the shelter, Baker had spent extra time talking with a young homeless man about job opportunities. On Friday afternoon, Thomas called both officers to his office. They arrived looking tired but somehow different from the men who had started the week. The arrogance was gone from their postures. They seemed more humble, more thoughtful. "Have a seat," Thomas said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. "I want to hear about your week." Wilson spoke first. "It was hard," he admitted. "Harder than I thought it would be. Not just the work, but how people looked at me. Or didn't look at me." Baker nodded in agreement. "Yesterday, I cleaned the men's restroom at Central Park. A guy came in while I was mopping. He looked right through me and then tracked mud all over my clean floor." He shook his head. "I wanted to say something, but then I realized that's probably how that man felt when we made him do push-ups for no reason." Thomas listened carefully, looking for signs of genuine understanding versus just saying what they thought he wanted to hear. "What was the hardest part?" Thomas asked. Wilson thought for a moment. "Realizing how wrong I was. I became a police officer to help people, to make the community better. Somewhere along the way, I started to think the badge made me better than everyone else." Thomas nodded slowly. "And what have you learned?" "That power is a responsibility," Wilson said quietly. "Not a privilege." 1 year had passed since that cold morning when Thomas Brown did push-ups on icy pavement. The winter had come around again, bringing fresh snow to the city, but many things had changed. Thomas stood at the front of the city council chamber presenting his annual report. Charts on the screen behind him showed positive trends. Crime was down across all neighborhoods. Citizen complaints against police. Officers had dropped by 70%. Community programs were growing, with more people volunteering than ever before. The Community First program has been our greatest success, Thomas explained to the council members. Over 200 police officers have now completed the training. They've worked alongside maintenance crews, served meals at shelters, and helped at community centers. The results speak for themselves. Council members nodded approvingly. Even those who had initially opposed the program now supported it, after seeing the positive changes in the city. After the meeting ended, Thomas gathered his papers. As he turned to leave, he noticed Officer Wilson waiting by the door. The officer was no longer in a regular patrol uniform, but instead wore the dark blue jacket of the community outreach team. "Mr. Brown, do you have a minute?" Wilson asked. Thomas nodded. "Of course." They walked together down the hallway toward Thomas's office. "I wanted to update you on Jack," Wilson said with a small smile. "The boy we found living under the bridge last month." Thomas remembered the case. A 12-year-old runaway had been living under a highway bridge for weeks. Instead of simply taking him to social services as they might have done in the past, Officers Wilson and Baker had personally worked to find him a good foster home. "He started school yesterday," Wilson continued. "His foster family says he's settling in well. Still quiet, but he's starting to trust them." "That's wonderful news," Thomas replied warmly. They reached Thomas's office and stopped outside the door. Wilson seemed to have something else on his mind. "Sir, there's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time," Wilson said, his voice more serious now. "That morning last year, it changed everything for me." Thomas waited quietly. "When I realized who you were, I thought my career was over," Wilson admitted. "I deserved to be fired. What we did was cruel and stupid." He looked directly at Thomas. "But instead of ending my career, you gave me a chance to remember why I became a police officer in the first place. I wanted to help people, to make a difference. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that." Thomas nodded. "We all need reminders sometimes about what truly matters. The thing is," Wilson continued, "that week of community service changed how I see people. Everyone has a story. Everyone deserves respect." He extended his hand. "Thank you for not firing me. For giving me the chance to be better." Thomas shook his hand firmly. "Second chances matter. But remember, it wasn't me who changed. The police department. It was officers like you who chose to be better." Later that afternoon, Thomas left his office early. He had promised to help serve dinner at the homeless shelter. As he walked through the city park, he noticed Officer Baker talking with a group of teenagers. The officer was showing them a basketball trick, making the kids laugh. It was a small thing, but important, building trust between police and young people. Thomas smiled to himself and continued walking. When he reached the spot where he had been pulled over a year ago, he paused. The memory no longer filled him with anger or shame. Instead, it reminded him of how a moment of humiliation had led to something much greater. At the shelter, Thomas put on an apron and took his place behind the serving counter. He wasn't there as the city manager, but as Thomas Brown, the same man who had mopped floors and cleaned toilets, the same man who believed in treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their position. As people came through the line, Thomas served them with a smile and a kind word. Some he knew by name from his many visits over the years. Others were new faces with stories he had yet to learn. Officer Wilson arrived midway through dinner service. He hung up his jacket and put on an apron without being asked. He wasn't there as part of any official program or assignment. He was there because he wanted to be. "Room for one more?" Wilson asked. "Always," Thomas replied, handing him a serving spoon. They worked side by side, serving those in need. No badges, no titles, no power differences. Just two men trying to make their community better, one meal at a time. As the evening wound down, Thomas watched the shelter fill with conversation and laughter. He realized that sometimes our lowest moments can become our greatest gifts. When we respond to cruelty with wisdom rather than revenge, we don't just change ourselves, we change the world around us.